Now, why has this issue sort of sparked and really created a lot of public interest? Because I'll talk about how we came onto it, but I think it's because people are still finding it hard. They're finding it hard to manage, pay their bills. Standards of living, prices have gone up in a way that incomes haven't. So their individual finances are still stretched, and they do pay their tax. Most people pay quite normally through PAYE, and they get particularly irate if they feel that they're paying and others aren't. And the other thing is, we are in a time when the public finances are under terrible threat, services are being cut, and in that context, for some people not to pay their fair contribution to the public purse for the common good is particularly distasteful and particularly wrong. And I think people feel that. And I think it's a combination of that pressure on individuals with a sense of unfairness about the way the extremely rich and global corporations get away with it that has really created the spark which has made it such a topical issue. Now, people always say to me, politicians have got to get the law right, and I agree with that. And there's a great deal that both the UK government could do nationally and working internationally, and I'll come back to that. But I want to start by saying I do still believe there is a moral dimension to this whole argument, and I don't think we can get the lawyers and accountants to get away with simply saying we stick by the law. And I'd argue it on a number of grounds. I think all of us as members of society do sort of make a social compact with our fellow citizens in that we come together and decide that we give according to our means into that common pot from the common good. And I just think that's part of the social compact that does make for good functioning, robust and dynamic societies. And to get away with saying, no, we only obey the law, we don't have an ethical dimension about our contribution to the common good, I just think is wrong. And the other thing is, it's just impossible to get the law right. If we could get the law right, wouldn't we have done so over the last, God knows how many centuries? There are always going to be ambiguities in the interpretation of the law. There were always going to be a variety of interpretations. There's always going to be inconsistencies. And that's what the army of very highly paid accountants and lawyers exploit for their clients in the work they do on advice around tax. So just telling government to get the law right is just too simplistic. And whilst we've got to do better, and I'll come back to that, we've got to do better, I just don't think it's a strong enough argument. Again, I think there's an ethical dimension because of the complexity of the law. The third thing is, I think companies, you know, I've now been around the public service for a very long time, and I remember when companies didn't have any corporate social responsibility dimension to their businesses at all. Now they do, and it's taken as read that companies feel they've got to put a contribution into their local community, or they've got to think about the work conditions of the people they employ, or they have to be conscious of their supply chain. All those are dimensions which are now accepted as norm in most companies. And I just think tax is the other bit of that agenda. Paying your fair share according to the profits you make in the jurisdiction in which you operate is just part of the corporate social responsibility. And one of the most fascinating things about the work we did over the last Parliament was seeing actually how a little session in front of the Public Accounts Committee absolutely knocked Starbucks' market share off course. And it didn't take very long, having not paid any tax for years and years and years, for the chief executive of Starbucks UK, I think he was, to give me a ring and tell me he was just going to be offering me £20 million of the tax. Never mind, I'm completely the wrong person to ring, and that's not how we decided. But he did do it. So reputation does count. And I think we should never underestimate the impact of that reputation, even on Google. I think over time, the arrogance of Google it'll come home and to them, and they will never be able to resist when you know, their monopoly in the market is challenged. So I think there are all sorts of ethical reasons why companies and individuals should think about paying their tax. I also think it's really important to say this, because I don't think actually the Labour Party did this very well during the election. This isn't an anti-business agenda. I've never seen it as an anti-business agenda. It's really a pro-fairness agenda. In fact, you can argue it's a pro-business agenda, because what we're trying to is, by ensuring everybody pays their fair share, ensure and promote real competition between businesses here in the UK. And I do get tired of hearing from too many businesses that, you know, they pay all sorts of other taxes, therefore why should they pay corporation tax? Well, they pay their payroll taxes, they pay their business rates, all these other sort of taxes. Well, we all pay a variety of taxes in our daily lives. We all pay income tax, and we pay our council tax, and we pay VAT on goods that we buy. And we don't think because we pay the VAT and the council tax, you shouldn't pay your income tax. And I think the same goes for businesses. And businesses also need the services that public expenditure provides. So they need the transport infrastructure to enable them to, and communications infrastructure, investment in broadband, all those things. They need that if their businesses are to prosper. They need a well-educated workforce if they're to recruit good people into the business. They need a healthy workforce if they're to sustain their business profitability. So they are as dependent on public services provided from the taxes they pay as is anybody else. The real killer argument for me on the pro-business argument is that if we don't have everybody paying their fair share, it actually damages British businesses and British jobs. So one of the great supporters we had in the argument was John Lewis, because John Lewis does pay its taxes, I think, nationally, but finds it very difficult to compete with Amazon if Amazon undercuts on price because they make arrangements which ensure that they don't pay their fair contribution. The same goes with Starbucks. If Starbucks can undercut because they don't pay their tax, the little community cafe gets damaged. So this is not an anti-business agenda, it's a pro-fairness agenda, and I think we have to be very, very clear about that. Now, we stumbled on this issue in the Public Accounts Committee. In fact, the real story, which I don't know if I told this publicly before, when I first became chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the first person to come up and congratulate me was actually the Tory MP, David Davis, who had previously been chair of Public Accounts, probably about 97. I mean, he'd been under the previous Labour government, because it's always chaired by a member of the opposition. And he looked at me and said, Vodafone, don't let them get away with it, Vodafone. And I thought, what on earth is he on about? What's this got to do with anything that we're doing? And then he said, look at Private Eye. You'll find out all about it in Private Eye. And he was right. And it was on. And I, at that point, thought, I can't understand why this has got anything to do with the Public Accounts Committee. When I read my Private Eye, I did understand it. And for those who haven't heard the story, I mean, what happened was we read in Private Eye. It's pathetic, isn't it? But that was really the basis for the whole of the work that we did on tax. We read in Private Eye about, I see here today, is Richard Brooks here? I don't know if he, anyway, he's a wonderful journalist, and he's the other...
Here in spirit.
He's here in spirit. Well, he also has been incredibly helpful to me down the years. But we read about the allegations that HMRC had done sweetheart deals both with Goldman Sachs and with Vodafone. So we had regular sessions with HMRC where we held them to account on the efficiency effectiveness of how they were collecting taxes on our behalf. And I asked them questions. I asked the head of tax about whether or not he'd done a sweetheart deal, particularly with both of them actually, but Goldman Sachs. He said he hadn't. And then after the session, I received a big brown envelope from a lawyer, an in-house lawyer in HMRC. And my clerk just said to me, look at it, because I did get a lot of brown envelopes. And there was a... did get. And there was a piece of paper in there which was the minutes of a meeting that had been held by the head of law in HMRC about the Goldman Sachs deal. And in that piece of paper there were two things. One, the assertion that the head of tax had shaken hands on the deal. We had denied that to the Treasury Select Committee. I think it was where he gave the very, very specific denial. And the second one was that the head of the law considered the deal unconscionable. I thought that was pretty strong stuff. So we called back the head of tax, questioned him, and he hid behind the confidentiality of taxpayers' interests, didn't tell us anything. And it was a very frustrating session. So we then called in the head of law, and we simply wanted him to tell us whether or not the minute was a true reflection of what had happened at the meeting. And he was obfuscating, waffling around. And my Tory vice chair, because this was so much a cross-party effort in my committee, my Tory vice chair just whispered to me, put the guy on oath. Now, this never happens in the House of Commons. And I'm putting witnesses on oath, but I whispered back, can't do that, can I? I'd only been in the job about 9 months. He said, yes, you can. I then turned to the clerk and said, can I put him on oath? The clerk says, yes, you can. So I said, go and find a Bible. And it took them 20 minutes to track down. They did eventually come back with the Bible. We did put the guy on oath. It didn't it didn't tell us anything really. He just managed to simply avoid the questions. But after that, what it did do is it drew attention to the whole issue. And about a few months after that, the head of tax did leave. And we embarked on our journey. And since that time, a lot of people have said, oh, Margaret, you did so much grandstanding in that committee. And in a way, I did. But I don't actually think that that was a bad thing. I have very few tools in my box. The Public Accounts Committee has no executive power. All we can do is draw attention to issues. All we can do is highlight issues. And if you need a little bit of drama to do that, I don't excuse that. It wasn't to promote me, it wasn't to promote the committee, it was to promote the issue. And I think actually we were incredibly effective. I remember being told off when we saw Google, because my colleagues, we'd sort of pre-met to plan how we were going to do that. We'd had a couple of whistleblowers and pretty stern stuff on Google. And one of the Tories said to me, Margaret, don't say anything provocative. So I thought, all right, I shall be really good. And at the end, I got so wound up. I'm sorry, I'm just human, so wound up. And I knew that their motto was, we don't do evil. And I thought after he had told us about how they, after we had this whistleblower's evidence, I turned around to him and said, you say you don't do evil. I think you do evil. And of course that became the headline that night. So Goldman Sachs started us off. That moved us to Starbucks when it was an investigative journalist who came to me from Reuters and told me the Starbucks story and how they'd avoided it. We felt we couldn't see Starbucks on their own, so we thought it'd be good to have Amazon in. They couldn't make the date, so I said, well, let's have Google in. They couldn't make the date, so we had to change the date and have 3 of them. So it was completely fortuitous that we ended up with Starbucks, Google and Amazon. And we went on from there. When I look back on it, I think 2 things. What was the most shocking? We looked at the boutique tax accountants, and I think they were shocking. I'll never forget having them up in front of us. These are the guys who helped the rich, net worth individuals like Jimmy Carr to get involved in aggressive tax avoidance schemes. And this guy, I said to him, go on, tell me your business model. And he just actually came back and he said, well, my business model is tax avoidance. And it was the sort of openness and blatancy of that admission that I think was what shocked me. And he literally, this guy had run 4 or 5 schemes. All of them had been closed down by HMRC, but between the time of launching the scheme and then it being closed down, he'd made zillions of money. And the only reason he'd been able to launch schemes, one of the people I didn't get to, I don't know if there were any of them in the audience today, was the lawyers signed off. And once you've got a lawyer's signature telling you a scheme is legitimate, you can market it and you're protected. as an advisor. So I think the lawyers actually have as much to answer for in this business as others. The other thing that I think shocked me was the whole issue of tax reliefs. And when we looked at that, and I will come back to that because I want to say what I think we should do. I want to try and be positive today. And I think the most shocking, we've got over 1,100 tax reliefs in the UK tax system, completely bonkers. Every chancellor sees it as his chance to give out a bit of sweetie at every. I bet we'll get some new ones in the budget that's coming up. They all give it a chance to give it. They can control something in the economy over the tax reliefs that they invent. Every tax relief becomes an opportunity for tax avoidance, every single one. And I think our most appalling example was gift aid tax relief, which we all tick that box. When I always do, I'm sure you all do, you all tick that box to try and get the gift aid to the charity that you're working with or the non-profit organisation that you're giving money to all the time. And there was this guy that we came across who'd set up a company called NT Advisors or something like that. Doesn't take NT, no tax. So no tax advisors had set up a charity based, I think it was in the Virgin Isles, something like that. It was in a tax haven. And that should have been a real red flag to the Charity Commission. They should never have authorised it as a legitimate charity, but they did. And then he just put loads of money, it was about £170 million, through that charity. He only ever gave one grant of £15,000 out to one youth group, but he claimed somewhere in the region of 45 million pounds in charitable tax relief. And that was, although in the end he didn't get away with it in that instance, it just shows the opportunity, and it was really shocking to me, of how Parliament intended one thing, and yet individuals determined to use the system to avoid tax interpreted in a way that Parliament never intended. So we did all this work, and I think there is a real agenda for action. I mean, I think, pat yourselves on the back, and we pat ourselves on the back, in that both government, nationally and internationally, are taking action now. I think we're much better placed than we were 3, 4, 5 years ago, although I think we've still got a long way to go. So I think the international action remains hugely important. The work that the OECD is doing around transparency, the more open we can be about where people make their profits, where they hold their assets are better. The more we can get country by country reporting, the better that will all be. And I hope that the OECD, I haven't been in touch with them recently, are trying to make that an more inclusive process now with some of the development charities, but they do have to get the big boys, and we have to take action on tax havens as well. So there's a lot of action there internationally. And I don't want that to go off the boil, so I'm hoping that whoever takes over my job, or I will be doing it anyway as a parliamentarian, will continue putting the pressure on there to keep that international action going. As far as this government goes, I am of the view, and I'm probably freer to say it post-election than I was before, that they do talk with forked tongue on the issue. So whilst on the one hand they claim to want to clamp down on tax avoidance, they are constantly inventing new schemes and new devices which enable people to avoid tax, in the belief, and they hold that belief, that that will attract inward investment into the UK and therefore bring growth and jobs. Now, I'm just going to tell you one story. It's the Starbucks story again. So they've done things like, the patent box is one tax relief they've brought in, the way they've dealt with controlled foreign companies, the way they've changed those rules and amended those rules, make it advantageous to be located here in the UK, and the way they've developed Eurobonds. Those were 3 that I came across. I've no doubt the accountants know of many more. But Starbucks again rang me up to tell me they were putting their HQ into the UK, hoping that I would welcome this. And of course I welcome inward investment and jobs and growth here. That's what we need in our economy. But then I said to him, so brilliant, so how many jobs are you bringing over? And there was a sort of deathly hush, and I said, well, 100? thinking I wasn't being overly ambitious, and for his HQ capable, it was under 10. It was under 10 jobs. So the idea that this is actually bringing real growth in the real economy into the UK, I think was fallacious. And he was coming here because the government had changed the rules in such a way to make it advantageous to have the HQ here. So I'm fed up with this forked tongue stuff, and intend to, over the coming months and years, expose it more than I was able to, chairing a cross-party committee. I do also think it is absolutely imperative that we simplify the tax system. It is absurd that we have over 1,100 tax reliefs. If you want to, there are tax reliefs which are expenditures. They are things that the government brings in to try and have an impact on the economy. So there'll be regional tax reliefs, research tax reliefs, all those sort of things, some of which have good intent. But actually, particularly if you're talking about tight budgets, to me it makes sense that you should consider those expenditures, and it's 100 billion a year, it's a lot of money. You should consider those expenditures alongside other expenditures. You shouldn't have the Chancellor just bringing that in at the last minute. So you make a choice about whether you want to give more money to the universities, for example, for research, or whether you want a tax relief that companies can take advantage of, claiming that they're doing research and development. So there's something about it being a very clouded way of taking decisions about expenditure, and there is this issue that the greater the complexity, the more people exploit that complexity. So I think we have really got to go for simplification. The government last time came in saying it was committed to simplification. It finished its period of government, its 5 years, with many more tax reliefs than it had inherited when it first came in. So whilst it abolished, I think it was less than 50, it introduced so many more that it didn't do the job. The other thing is toughening up HMRC. I was so depressed to read that yet again HMRC is losing staff. It's just very, very short term. All money that we invest in trying to ensure that everybody pays their proper contribution, every pound gives us £9 back. I haven't seen a figure that nobody has ever contradicted that, and for as long as that remains true, it's obviously sensible to keep putting money into HMRC. And the other thing, I mean, I've always said this jokingly, but there's a bit of truth in this. I would actually give some of the accountants a contract to see whether or not they couldn't be more successful at getting the money in, because they're so much better paid. Trying to keep, it's a real David and Goliath battle there between the accountants and HMRC. I mean, we looked at transfer pricing. It's an old figure I bring up. The accountants at that time, when we interviewed them, the four big ones had 250 people working in transfer pricing. HMRC, they've increased it. They've gone from 65 to the last figure I saw was 85. I mean, it's pathetic and much less well paid, and therefore you're constantly playing catch up, and it's very, very difficult to do it. So I toughen them up. I would litigate more. I don't understand why HMRC, they're not just slow at doing things, but they are they simply don't litigate enough, and it takes them so long. When we looked at film tax relief, which was one which was really appallingly exploited, not to the purpose that Parliament intended. It took them 10, 15 years. I mean, they're still litigating some of those cases there. So, I think on that we may get something in the budget, but nevertheless, speed and determination to litigate. My other things is I think that we have got to constantly argue for greater transparency. Everybody hides behind this confidentiality of taxpayers' interest. I have to tell you that despite all the work we did, I still don't know whether the deal with Vodafone was fair or not, whether the allegation in Private Eye that they should have paid £6 billion was right or wrong against the £2 billion they finally paid, and whether it was fair that they should have been let off the interest and allowed 5 years to pay back. I just don't know. And I think for a big publicly quoted company, I just can't see that the world would fall apart if we had greater transparency, not just knowing what they finally paid, but knowing how that decision on what they should pay was reached in the negotiations between HMRC and the company. So I would go for greater transparency on the FTSE Top 100, see if the world falls apart. If it doesn't, then we can think about greater transparency right through the system. I think we ought to much more assertively use our power of public procurement, so that I think it's outrageous that anybody who aggressively avoids tax should be then benefit in terms of contracts and profits from contracts that are given out, funded by the taxpayers' money. And I'm afraid I also think that the advisors should start bearing some responsibility for the advice they give. At the moment, if a scheme is found to be inconsistent with the law, the person has to pay, or the company has to pay back the tax they owed. The advisor doesn't, and it's the advisors actually who are constantly finding new avenues. So I think we should be much tougher there than we are. I don't yet know who's going to take over the Public Accounts Committee. We'll know that next week. I do know that all the candidates who for the chairmanship are all very enthusiastic about keeping this going. And I do know from having talked to the Conservative, in effect, Vice Chair, that he sees this as the highlight of the work that they're doing. So I think we've touched a real raw nerve with this. And I think our job in Parliament rather than government, with your job in civil society, wherever you are, is actually to keep that nerve raw. Because we're only at the beginnings of getting a system in place where all we ask is that everybody pays their fair share according to their individual wealth or according to the profits that they make from a company that where they're doing their business here in this jurisdiction. It's not a massively radical, revolutionary ask. It's hugely important, both for the common good and for that sense of fairness, which is so British and so important to us all. So keep going over the current period. I'll be with you, and well done for where you've got today.